Hello there. My name is James Gilmer. I'm the User Services Librarian at Pfeiffer Library, and today I'm going to be telling you all about the Makerspace and specifically the 3D printer. We've got a lot to cover today and a lot of different things to talk about, so let's dive right in. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to need in order to do any 3D printing is an STL file of the model that I want to make. Now, if you have 3D modeling skills, you could use a program like Blender or Tinkercad to make a 3D model of whatever idea that you have in mind, turn that design into something that you can 3D print pretty easily. I don't know how to use Blender. It's on my to-do list, has been for a while. So instead, I get most of my STL files from My Mini Factory and Thingiverse. They're two excellent digital repositories of designs, some of which are free, some of which are for sale, that allow me to create things even if they're not exactly what I have in mind, right? I can still find some cool designs that I'm able to use. And that's what I would recommend for all of you as well, unless you can work Blender or other 3D modeling software. Now, let's say that I wanted to print a Dungeons and Dragons character. I have a ranger in mind, and I want to see what options are available. I'm going to type that into the search bar here and click on that little magnifying glass, and that's going to do a search through all of My Mini Factory and turn up 2080 objects that fit those general parameters, a ranger. And the ones that I see here, any of those would work for the type of character model that I have in mind. You'll notice that all of them on this page, and this set of search results at least, cost money. And they tell you that that first model's $5.87 for a Dwarven Ranger. If I really like this particular model and I want to see other things by that designer, I can also click on their link below. Now, if I decide that it's cool, but I don't necessarily want to spend money on the design, I can click over here in Free Objects instead and filter by clicking on Search below to only include free models. I have much fewer choices ahead of me, 147 objects instead of 2080, and they're not quite as close to what I had in mind. But let's say that this Goliath Ranger fits sort of the general vibes of what I had in mind. So once I've found a model that I like, I can scroll through the pictures and get a general idea of whether or not this model is going to suit my needs. Once I've decided that I like it, that I want to download it, if it's a free model, I'll have a download button. If it is a model that's for sale, I'll have an option to buy it, and then I can go up to my cart over there and finish the purchase. Now, one thing that you want to keep in mind when you're looking through STL files and 3D models is that they usually come in two variations. You have your unsupported models, this Goliath aim.stl, and you have your pre-supported models, Goliath bow supported. Now, either of those can go onto the 3D printer. You're going to see in a moment when we look at G2Box that the workflow is much easier if the model is already supported. There's much less work that I have to do in order to make that model a reality. Okay, so that was My Mini Factory. Now I'm going to look at Thingiverse and repeat my search for a ranger, for a Dungeons and Dragons character. Thingiverse hosts primarily free models, in fact I think exclusively free models, and that means that usually I have fewer options to work with, although it looks like with 5 pages of results, it's probably pretty close. The other thing that I will say about Thingiverse is that you're less likely to find models that are pre-supported, although you'll find some that are pre-supported. It's just not the norm. Once I click on a model that I like, same thing, I can scroll through, I can look at different pictures of it to see if it actually fits my needs. I can then download all of the files, and that will allow me to put that on the printer. If I look at the files themselves, you'll see that we have a version of the model on a base and a version of the model that is not on the base. Neither version of the model is pre-supported, so I do have to worry about adding supports to this model before I'm able to print it. Okay, so once I've found a model that I want to 3D print, I'm going to download that model onto the hard drive, onto a USB drive, somewhere that I can find it again. From here, I'm going to open up Chitubox. Chitubox is our slicing software that works with the 3D printer. It turns that model and any supports that I might need to add into it into a series of slices that the 3D printer can interpret and turn into a 3D printed object. So Chitubox has this little blue background with a white plus sign in the middle. That's how you'll recognize it. And all of the settings for the resin itself are pre-configured for you. So all we'll need to do is import the model that we want to 3D print. We'll need to change the orientation of it a little bit, add some supports to it, we'll slice it, we'll put that onto a USB drive, and then we'll put it in the printer in order to print it. So the first step is going to be to import our model. I'm going to go to Open at the top left corner. I'm going to choose a model that I have already sort of planned out here. Double click on that, and that brings the model into Chitubox. I can zoom in and out by scrolling with the mouse wheel. Scrolling away from me zooms in, pulling that mouse wheel back towards me zooms out. If I hold down the right mouse button and move the mouse, I can change the angle of my view. And if I left click and drag with the mouse, I can move my model around. I can also change some other things. So I can move the model around. It's usually a good idea to print in the center of the plate. It's the most stable area. It's the most likely place to succeed. So if I only have one model, the center is a good place for it. I can start adding other models later on if I want to print more in one go. The other thing that I want to do is I'm going to change the orientation, so the rotation of this 3D model. When we're 3D printing using a resin printer, large flat surfaces are the most difficult thing for a resin 3D printer to handle. So that flat base, if that whole flat surface is on the printer, it's going to have a little more trouble, and it's more likely that the model will separate from the build plate during printing. So what I will usually do is change this X dimension. I usually do -15 degrees. So I can click on there, I can type in -15, and then if I press tab, it's automatically going to make that adjustment. I can also click and drag on the red line here to change the model's orientation. Either way will work. I just like the quick typing. It's a little more precise. The other thing that I want to do is I've tilted the model in one dimension. I want to tilt it in the other dimension, the Y dimension as well. Again, just a few degrees. So 15 degrees, negative, we'll make that -30, round that off. And that should set us up with a nice tilted model that has no large flat surfaces that could work like a suction cup. Once I have my model rotated so that it's no longer angled for that flat surface against the build plate, now I need to support my model. This is why that pre-supported version is handy, but not necessarily essential. At the top right, you're going to see this little icon. It's a piece that has supports connected to it. I suppose it's kind of like a Greek temple is the first thing I think of. If I click on that icon, we're going to bring up our support menu. Now, all of the settings for the supports are pre-configured. You don't need to worry about changing anything here. You can actually just click on Auto Support, and J2Box will calculate where supports need to go in order to make sure that your model doesn't separate from the build plate, and also to make sure that any piece that would start in mid-air, as it were, is connected to some other piece of the model. One thing we haven't talked about yet is the 3D printing process for a resin printer starts at the very bottom here and moves its way up. So pieces that hang down, like her bow, that connect higher up on the model but don't connect to the build plate are going to print in mid-air unless they're connected by supports to the build plate. So what we're doing, as I hold down the right mouse button and scroll to pan around, any areas that I see that are in red should have some kind of support somewhere nearby. I can usually rely on the auto supports to handle this. I don't usually need to add many additional supports, but the number one rule of 3D printing is that no amount of supports is too much. The only thing that you're going to do by adding more supports is make your model less likely to separate from the build plate, and you will add some divots anywhere that supports need to be removed. So we do like to strike a balance between how nice the model looks when it's done and how likely it is to successfully print. This model would print just fine as it is. If I wanted to be extra thorough, I could move my mouse pointer over to some of these other areas that are kind of crimson and add just a few more supports. That will ensure that those parts print without any issues. I'll continue to do that around the center of the base. As I said, large flat areas are the hardest for the printer to handle. So I usually, if I'm adding more supports, I usually add more supports to the base. The other thing is that the base is on the bottom of the model, and most of the time people can't see it anyway. So if you cover this with a couple extra supports, that's not a bad thing. Once I'm done adding supports, I'm just going to click on this other heading to the top right over here. And I'm actually going to click on this home button to bring us back to an overhead view so I can see what my model looks like right now. I'm going to zoom in a little bit just to take a look at things. I don't see any parts of the model that are not connected to a support or not connected to a part of the model that is lower than, so like the corner of the bow. That's not connected to a support, but it is connected to the rest of the bow, which will be printed first. I'm fairly confident that this model will print smoothly without any issues. So next I'm going to click on Slice. Slice has the printing software. T2Box looks at the model and it divides it into sections. Each section has our layer height of 0.04 millimeters, extremely small, as a two-dimensional shape. If I scroll back to the beginning here, I can demonstrate what that looks like. So the very bottom, the base of the model is just this flat pancake that is 0.04 millimeters tall and which connects directly to the build plate. It is that two-dimensional object that will shine through the bottom of the printer and solidify the resin. The next levels are the same until we get to our supports. Those become little dots. They each are, the light shines through to form that piece of the model. And as we move up and up, we're going to see the model gradually form in contact with our supports and hopefully in contact with lower pieces of the model. I can see from the right here that this is going to take 1,075 layers in order to make a model that is 43 millimeters tall. Because of the amount of exposure time and distance involved as the printer is moving up and down to do each level, it shows that this model is going to take nearly 4 hours to print. It will use 4.7 milliliters of resin, and when I save this file, which is the next thing I'm going to do, I want to make sure to include that information. And so for our final step, I would save this file. I would want to make sure that the file is saved on a USB drive if I had one plugged in. We'll just use the original directory. You save the file to somewhere where you know you can find it again. You'll name the file something like your last name and then an underscore, and then what I want to include so that I can keep track from the library's perspective of how much usage the printer is getting and how quickly we need to replace parts. We'll put in the number of hours that this print is going to take, and I would round up or down. So 4 hours for this one. If it was 3 hours and 25 minutes, I might put 3.5 hours, something like that. It doesn't have to be exact. Rounded off to the nearest half hour is fine. I then want to record how many milliliters of resin we're using. This one too, I can round that off. Instead of 4.7, we'll just call this 5 milliliters. And then we'll press save. That's going to save the file that will tell the printer how to make this model. We're going to press no here because I already know where that file is saved. In a real printing scenario, I would save that on a USB drive. I would then eject the USB drive, plug it into the 3D printer, and start the print. And that should just about do it. Within a few hours, the model that you've chosen will be converted from a 3D model that exists only digitally into a resin printed object. Please allow a business day after that for library staff to take the finished model and clean it in isopropyl alcohol, run it through the rest of our post-processing procedures so that we can make sure that the model is clean, supports are removed, and the model has been cured in our UV curing station. After that point, the model will be safe to touch, and you're free to paint it in the library using the paints that we have available, or to take it home as it is. It's entirely up to you. If you have any questions about the 3D printing process, need help finding models, any of the above, feel free to reach out to the library at library@tiffin.edu, and we hope to see you often.